everybody. Yeah, this is part of kind of an ongoing set of conversations. And each of our papers, I think, have changed quite a bit since we started trying to think about this a few years ago. In 2005, the Bush administration calculated that they could, quote, weather the damage, regardless of whether Katrina was a direct hit or one of the numerous near misses. No doubt they were hoping for a Gustav-type scenario where the storm veered the few degrees necessary to avoid catastrophe. Even as the post-storm disaster unfolded, the administration was already breathing a collective sigh of relief that the damage had been relatively minor. As it became clear that the crisis was not over, it also became clear that the Bush administration had never really believed they would be held accountable for the fate of New Orleans citizens who could not evacuate the city. The national outrage over the callous abandonment of the city's most vulnerable residents came as a shock, and their public pronouncements showed just how out of touch they were. I think with Barbara Bush really leading the way, the most heinous example suggesting that for many of the evacuees, Katrina was a blessing in disguise. Today, while outside the city, Katrina is mostly remembered, and if you watch the news or kind of listen to the punditry, as the beginning of the end for the Bush administration's fatal slide. But in the city, the government failure from day one is still etched on the landscape itself. The limited amount of residential rebuilding has come from efforts of city residents and outside volunteers, Bali tourism. Post-storm, as prior to it, New Orleans and Louisiana sit at the bottom of national income averages, with the elderly and African-American citizens disproportionately represented. Promised federal aid has been intolerably slow, and in most recent surveys, the majority of city residents say they have been forgotten by the rest of the nation. However, New Orleans and Katrina were briefly in the headlines again last month thanks to Louisiana Governor Bobby Jindal's first refusal of the additional unemployment benefits offered by the federal stimulus package and his nationally televised response to President Obama's speech to Congress. In his primetime response, Jindal actually used the Bush administration's inaction and criminal incompetence in the aftermath of Katrina as a model for local self-sufficiency, and to argue that the federal government has no useful role to play in solving Louisiana's or the nation's problems. I was interested in the reaction to Jindal's speech because mostly it was characterized as a colossal failure. He was ridiculed for everything from his amateurish delivery to his resemblance to Kenneth the Page on 30 Rock. The fact that his Katrina anecdote included a self-aggrandizing lie about himself in the center of the crisis also gave the story additional shelf life. But I think in dismissing Jindal as a fool or a liar or a bad performer or an opportunist out of his league is to really miss the point of his deliberate argument. And his alignment with a particular element, a particular and long-standing element of U.S. political life. Despite what so many refer to euphemistically as his interesting background or his distinctive biography, presumably meaning he's the son of immigrants from India, Jindal has affiliated himself with a powerful strand of regionalism, exceptionalism, and racialism that traditionally opposed efforts to make politics and government the site of a robust and vigorous citizens' debate over the collective good. His repeated phrase that night, "Americans can do anything," was meant to buff up two of the most insidious myths of our national political life: that Americans are a unified people where everyone is equally valued and valuable, and that this unity translates into our natural role as a global hegemon. On a much more local level, his tribute to renegade Sheriff Harry Lee, the hero of his Katrina story, has to be recast in context of Lee's subsequent exposure as an unapologetic racial profiler. So as we all know, those of us who are historians, writing a history of the present is extremely treacherous, as is using the past to speculate on the current moment. Nevertheless, I want to use historical representations of New Orleans to challenge Jindal's political claims and to suggest the importance of New Orleans as both a physical place, a critical symbol, and a template for a very different kind of American citizenship, a kind that gets really covered over by Jindal's narrative. Because myth, as much or more as history, seems to figure so centrally in New Orleans' past and present, just just going to remind us briefly of the definition offered by French cultural critic Roland Barthes more than 50 years ago. Myth, for Barthes, is that which produces the appearance of coherence in the social order. Myth represents people, objects, and events stripped of their rich particularity and recycled as easily grasped universal concepts. Myth, in short, suppresses history. In the aftermath of Katrina, we were subject to a number of these myths. The bad behavior of the urban underclasses, represented by the wholesale and later disproved accusations of looting and destruction. Another was the portrayal of African Americans as a dangerous and criminal class, represented by unsubstantiated stories of rape, shootings, stabbings, robbery, and murder. A third was government good intentions overwhelmed by the force of natural disaster. And here we might think of Bush's badly conceived airplane ride over the flooded city. Later, he admitted he thought that was his only mistake in responding to the crisis. Okay, for Barthes, myth often succeeds against a mountain of contrary evidence, in other words, the facts, by creating a narrative that makes dominant interests seem natural and self-evident. The administration seemed to be counting on this in the wake of the disaster, and really, why not? From Reagan's invention of welfare queens to Bush the first Willie Horton ads to Clinton's decimation of welfare based on his bootstrap notion of personal responsibility, blaming the poor, especially the urban poor, and especially the black urban poor, seem to have worked. Electoral results since the 80s suggested a majority of US citizens were persuaded of the benefits, or even actually the moral righteousness of shredding the safety net to protect our hard-earned wealth from their intransigent refusal to join the system, in Clinton's words, to work hard and play by the rules. So who could exactly blame the administration for believing that once again they would have popular sentiment on their side? Once public anger did start to turn, they shifted tactics, but again in ways that showed their commitment to the art of myth. So the Jackson Square was temporarily backlit for the president's address to the nation, suggesting that power had been restored, which it hadn't been. A portable aid station was quickly assembled to serve as a backdrop for the presidential and vice presidential visits to the region. It could be put down. Bush or Cheney could pass out care packages to grateful recipients, and the whole thing could be broken down and moved on. And luckily for us, a German camera crew captured the entire operation. Yet the power of myth is such that the restoration of history, or this exposure of the facts, is not sufficient to challenge the political frameworks that preserve its cultural power. And moreover, and this is what I want to suggest and where New Orleans comes in, I think the Bush administration was counting on another myth, more pervasive and subtle than the first, and one that's received virtually no investigation. And that was the myth of New Orleans exceptionalism, its un-American origins, the whiff of ill repute that often haunts its history, and Linnell's going to talk quite a bit more about this. Bush himself exposed this when on his first trip to the city. He couldn't help reminiscing about his time in New Orleans during his drinking years, lamenting the storm's impact on America's party destination. In both academic and popular accounts, there's an overarching tendency to focus on what is distinctive about New Orleans. Most historical accounts start with French and Spanish origins, then turn to New Orleans as center of the southern slave trade after the onset of American rule. And this history inevitably turns towards forms of exoticism, sensuality, and allusions to racial mixing. Popular histories contribute their share in this. New Orleans almost always combines, and I should say the trope of New Orleans almost always combines foreignness, heat, disease, sexual promiscuity, and racial concubinage into a roiling, overheated stew, frequently described through evoking the local cuisine. Quote, New Orleans gumbo of legend and truth, as one tourist pamphlet describes it. The political calculus regarding New Orleans relied on these elements that characterize New Orleans as it's often described, the least American of southern cities. But more than that, and this is a kind of a peeling the onion, central to this foreignness has always been the implicit or implied connection to race, and its key role in troubling the processes of Americanization.